There's a specific reason covert narcissism causes more lasting psychological damage than its louder, more obvious counterpart, and it has nothing to do with severity in any simple sense. It has to do with detection, with the specific, insidious way this particular pattern manages to hide in plain sight, disguised so thoroughly as sensitivity, humility, and quiet suffering that even the people closest to someone exhibiting these traits often spend years, sometimes their entire relationship, without ever fully recognizing what they're actually dealing with. Today, I want to walk you through exactly why covert narcissism is so uniquely dangerous, what specifically makes it so much harder to identify and name than its more obvious counterpart, and why understanding this specific danger matters enormously for anyone who's ever felt confused, exhausted, or quietly diminished by someone who by every outward measure seems too gentle, too self-effacing, too obviously wounded to be causing the damage you're actually experiencing. To understand why covert narcissism is so uniquely dangerous, you first have to understand the fundamental disguise mechanism at its core, because this mechanism explains almost everything else we'll discuss today. Overt narcissism announces itself relatively clearly: grandiosity, obvious need for admiration, visible defensiveness when criticized, behavior that most people, even without specialized psychological knowledge, eventually recognize as excessive or self-centered. Covert narcissism operates through an almost opposite presentation, one built specifically around humility, self-deprecation, and a persistent narrative of being overlooked, misunderstood, or victimized. This isn't simply a milder version of the same underlying pattern. It's a fundamentally different disguise, one specifically designed, whether consciously or through years of practiced instinct, to generate sympathy and protection rather than admiration and status, while pursuing the exact same underlying need: validation, control, and a continuous stream of attention organized around their emotional experience through an entirely different, much harder to detect mechanism. The first specific danger of covert narcissism involves what I'd call sympathy weaponization, the systematic use of genuine vulnerability, genuine past wounds, genuine suffering, deployed strategically to prevent accountability and generate continuous emotional labor from the people around them. This is uniquely dangerous because it exploits one of the most valuable, most important human capacities: genuine compassion for someone's pain, turning that compassion into a tool that actively works against the compassionate person's own well-being. When someone consistently, skillfully redirects any confrontation about their behavior toward their own pain and suffering, the person attempting to hold them accountable finds themselves in an impossible position, caught between legitimate concerns about behavior that's genuinely harming them and genuine, deeply held compassion for suffering that may well be real, even while being deployed strategically to avoid the accountability that would otherwise be entirely appropriate. This dynamic is uniquely dangerous precisely because it corrupts compassion itself, turning one of the most valuable human capacities into a mechanism that perpetuates harm rather than preventing it. The second specific danger involves the particular difficulty of identifying covert narcissistic patterns to other people, especially people who haven't experienced the dynamic directly and who tend to evaluate the person exhibiting these patterns based on surface presentation alone. This creates a uniquely isolating experience for anyone trying to name what they're actually experiencing, because when they describe the specific behaviors causing them harm, those descriptions often sound, to an outside listener, disproportionate or unfair when compared against the gentle, humble, self-effacing presentation this person typically displays in public or in front of others. "He always seems so quiet and sensitive," a friend might say, genuinely confused by an account of manipulation and control that doesn't match their own limited observation of someone's public presentation. This gap between private experience and public perception is uniquely dangerous because it isolates victims of covert narcissism from exactly the kind of validating, supportive response that would otherwise help them trust their own perception and begin building toward genuine clarity about what they're actually experiencing. The third specific danger involves the particular vulnerability covert narcissism creates around guilt and self-blame, a vulnerability that operates more insidiously and more effectively than the more obvious guilt-tripping tactics associated with overt narcissistic behavior. Because covert narcissists frame themselves consistently as victims, as misunderstood, as suffering more than anyone realizes, any expression of frustration or any attempt at boundary setting from the people around them tends to get reframed, both by the covert narcissist and often, eventually, by the person attempting the boundary themselves, as evidence of cruelty towards someone who's already struggling enough without additional criticism or confrontation. This specific dynamic produces a uniquely effective form of guilt, one that doesn't require the covert narcissist to actively accuse anyone of anything. The victim narrative does the guilt-inducing work automatically, making anyone who dares to name a legitimate concern feel as though they're piling additional suffering onto someone already carrying more than their fair share, regardless of how genuinely harmful the covert narcissist's actual behavior has been. The fourth specific danger involves the particular way covert narcissism corrodes a target's trust in their own perception over time, a process that operates more gradually and more insidiously than the more obvious gaslighting tactics associated with overt narcissistic patterns. Because covert narcissists rarely make dramatic, obviously false claims that can be clearly identified and rejected, the erosion of perception happens through countless smaller moments. A slight reframing here, a subtle redirection of blame there, a persistent quiet suggestion that you're being too harsh, too demanding, too unreasonable in expecting basic reciprocity from someone who's clearly struggling. This gradual erosion is uniquely dangerous because it doesn't produce the kind of dramatic, obvious confusion that might eventually trigger someone to seek outside perspective or support. It produces a slow, almost imperceptible drift away from confident self-trust, one that leaves the person experiencing it increasingly uncertain about their own judgment, without ever fully understanding why that uncertainty has developed or where it actually came from. The fifth specific danger involves the particular difficulty of ever achieving genuine closure or clear resolution with someone exhibiting covert narcissistic patterns, a difficulty that stems directly from the same victim-centered narrative that defines this entire presentation. With overt narcissism, at least the confrontation, when it eventually happens, tends to be relatively clear: obvious defensiveness, obvious denial, a pattern that, however frustrating, at least presents itself with a certain clarity that allows the person confronting it to eventually reach a stable, confident conclusion about what actually happened. Covert narcissism resists this same clarity because any attempt at direct confrontation tends to produce not denial exactly, but a kind of deflection into pain and suffering that makes the entire interaction feel unresolved, ambiguous, permanently suspended in a fog where the covert narcissist's own hurt feelings become the primary subject of conversation, regardless of what legitimate concern originally prompted the confrontation. This lack of resolution is uniquely dangerous because it keeps people entangled far longer than more obvious patterns typically allow, always hoping for a clarity and accountability that this specific presentation is almost structurally incapable of ever genuinely providing. I want to talk now about the specific psychological origin of covert narcissism, because understanding this origin helps explain why this particular presentation develops in the first place and why it operates so differently from the more obvious grandiosity most people associate with narcissistic patterns generally. Covert narcissism frequently develops in children who learned, early in their development, that direct, obvious demands for admiration or attention were met with punishment, criticism, or rejection, while expressions of vulnerability, suffering, or sensitivity reliably generated care, sympathy, and attention instead. This early learning shapes an entirely different strategic approach to the same underlying need for validation and control that drives narcissistic patterns generally, one built around victimhood and sensitivity rather than grandiosity and obvious self-promotion. Understanding this origin doesn't excuse the harmful behavior this pattern produces, but it does explain why covert narcissism operates through such a fundamentally different mechanism, one specifically calibrated to generate sympathy rather than admiration, precisely because sympathy proved, at some crucial developmental period, to be the more reliable, more consistently available source of the attention and validation their psychology desperately needed. I also want to address something important about why covert narcissism often proves particularly dangerous, specifically within family systems, romantic relationships, and other close, ongoing connections, rather than in more casual or temporary interactions. The strategic use of sympathy and victimhood requires an audience genuinely willing to extend compassion and patience over an extended period, which means covert narcissistic patterns tend to be most effective, and therefore most consistently deployed, within exactly the kind of close, committed relationships where genuine care and patience are reasonably expected and reasonably extended in the early stages of any healthy connection. This means the people most likely to encounter covert narcissism in its most damaging, most sustained form are precisely the people who care most deeply, who extend the most genuine compassion, who are least likely to simply walk away at the first sign of difficulty, because walking away at early signs of difficulty is exactly the response that would prevent this specific pattern from ever fully developing into the sustained, damaging dynamic it eventually becomes, with someone willing to remain patient and compassionate for long enough. This means the people most likely to encounter covert narcissism in its most damaging, most sustained form are precisely the people who care most deeply, who extend the most genuine compassion, who are least likely to simply walk away at the first sign of difficulty, because walking away at early signs of difficulty is exactly the response that would prevent this specific pattern from ever fully developing into the sustained, damaging dynamic it eventually becomes, with someone willing to remain patient and compassionate for long enough. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding why covert narcissism is so dangerous is only useful if it also equips you with a genuine, practical path toward recognizing it clearly in your own life and protecting yourself from its uniquely insidious effects. The first thing worth understanding about actually protecting yourself from covert narcissism is that recognition requires a specific shift in what you're looking for, one that differs meaningfully from the more obvious red flags associated with overt narcissistic behavior. Instead of watching for grandiosity, obvious arrogance, or visible need for admiration, you need to watch for a much subtler pattern: the consistent, reliable redirection of any accountability conversation toward their own suffering, regardless of how legitimate or measured your original concern actually was. This pattern, once you know specifically what to look for, becomes remarkably consistent and remarkably identifiable, even though it initially hides behind a presentation of genuine gentleness and sensitivity that makes it feel almost cruel to name clearly, even to yourself. The second thing worth understanding is how to distinguish genuine vulnerability, the kind that deserves real compassion and support, from strategic vulnerability, the kind specifically deployed to avoid accountability, because this distinction matters enormously and requires more nuance than simply becoming suspicious of anyone who expresses genuine pain or difficulty. The key distinguishing factor isn't whether someone expresses vulnerability at all, but rather the timing and function of that vulnerability within the specific context of accountability conversations. Genuine vulnerability, expressed by someone without covert narcissistic patterns, doesn't consistently reliably appear specifically at the exact moment they're being asked to take responsibility for behavior that harmed you. Strategic vulnerability does exactly this, appearing with remarkable, almost suspicious consistency precisely when accountability is being requested, and disappearing just as reliably once the accountability conversation has been successfully redirected toward managing their emotional state instead. The third thing worth exploring is how to actually hold boundaries with someone exhibiting covert narcissistic patterns without falling into the guilt trap we discussed extensively in the first part of this conversation, because this requires a specific kind of internal preparation that differs from boundary setting with more overtly difficult behavior. The most effective approach involves separating, clearly and deliberately in your own mind, compassion for someone's underlying pain from continued tolerance of behavior that harms you, understanding that these two things, while they can coexist in theory, don't actually require each other in practice. You can genuinely believe that someone's covert narcissistic patterns developed from real, legitimate childhood wounds, and still refuse to continue absorbing the consequences of behavior those wounds now produce in their adult relationships. Holding this distinction clearly, especially in the actual moment when guilt is being activated through their strategic vulnerability, requires real practice and real internal discipline, but it's genuinely possible once you understand exactly what's happening and why your natural compassion is being specifically targeted rather than randomly triggered. The fourth thing to understand is how to manage the specific isolation we discussed as the second danger. The difficulty of having other people fully understand or validate your experience when it contradicts their own limited observation of someone's public, humble presentation. This particular challenge often requires accepting, at least temporarily, that not everyone in your life will be capable of fully understanding this specific dynamic without either witnessing it directly themselves or receiving very specific, detailed education about how covert narcissism actually operates. Rather than exhausting yourself trying to convince every person in your life of an experience they simply don't have the framework to fully comprehend, it often serves you better to identify a smaller number of people genuinely capable of holding this complexity, reserving your deepest need for validation and support for those specific relationships, while accepting more measured, more limited engagement from people who simply aren't positioned to fully grasp what you're actually navigating. The fifth thing worth understanding is how to rebuild the specific trust in your own perception that we discussed as being gradually eroded by prolonged exposure to covert narcissistic patterns. Because this rebuilding process requires deliberate, patient practice rather than simply deciding intellectually that your perception was accurate all along. This rebuilding often benefits significantly from external structure, whether that's professional support from a therapist familiar with these specific dynamics, or a careful, deliberate practice of documenting your own observations and checking them later against how situations actually unfold. Gradually accumulating evidence that your perception is more reliable than years of subtle erosion may have led you to believe. This process takes genuine time, and expecting instant restoration of confident self-trust after prolonged exposure to this specific kind of gradual perceptual erosion sets you up for unnecessary frustration with a healing process that, by its nature, requires patience and sustained, deliberate practice. I want to talk now about something important regarding the specific grief involved in recognizing covert narcissistic patterns in someone you've loved deeply. Because this grief often carries a particular complexity that deserves genuine, careful attention rather than being rushed past toward simpler, more triumphant conclusions. Unlike grief following more obviously cruel behavior, grief following the recognition of covert narcissistic patterns often involves genuine confusion about how to feel towards someone whose suffering may well be real, whose wounds may well have legitimate origins, and whose harmful behavior exists alongside genuine moments of real connection and real, if limited, capacity for love. This grief requires holding, simultaneously, real compassion for someone's authentic pain and real clarity about the genuine harm their strategic deployment of that pain has caused you, a holding pattern that resists easy resolution into either simple anger or simple continued sympathy, requiring instead a more complex, more nuanced kind of acceptance that both truths can exist simultaneously without canceling each other out. I also want to address something honestly about why leaving relationships involving covert narcissism often proves more difficult in certain specific ways than leaving relationships involving more overtly damaging behavior. The absence of dramatic, obvious cruelty means the decision to leave often lacks the kind of clear, unambiguous justification that more overt patterns typically provide, leaving people second-guessing whether their reasons for leaving are actually legitimate, whether they're perhaps being too harsh towards someone who, by every outside measure, seems gentle and struggling rather than genuinely harmful. I want to address this directly and clearly, The absence of dramatic, obviously cruel behavior doesn't mean the harm you've experienced isn't legitimate or serious. Covert harm is still harm. Sustained emotional labor extracted through strategic vulnerability is still exploitation. And the gradual erosion of your own confidence and self-trust is still genuine damage, regardless of how gentle, how quiet, how seemingly harmless the person causing that damage appears to everyone else observing from a comfortable distance. I want to say something directly now to anyone listening who recognizes their own experience in everything we've discussed today, who's spent years feeling confused, exhausted, quietly diminished by someone whose gentle, humble presentation made naming your actual experience feel almost cruel or unfair. Your exhaustion is legitimate. Your confusion, while painful, reflects an accurate response to a genuinely confusing, genuinely difficult to name dynamic, not evidence of your own oversensitivity or unreasonable expectations. The specific danger of covert narcissism lies precisely in how effectively it obscures itself, how skillfully it recruits your own compassion against your own well-being, and recognizing this pattern clearly, even years into a relationship, even after considerable confusion and self-doubt, represents genuine, significant progress, rather than evidence that you should have somehow recognized it sooner or more easily than you actually did. So picture this. The way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic confrontation where you finally publicly expose this pattern to everyone who previously struggled to understand your experience, but something quieter, something that reflects how this specific kind of clarity actually tends to develop and stabilize over time. Picture yourself, months or years past your clearest recognition of this pattern, encountering a familiar bid for sympathy specifically deployed at the exact moment accountability was being requested, and noticing, with quiet, hard-won clarity, rather than confusion or guilt, exactly what you're witnessing, exactly why it's happening, and exactly how to respond without falling into the specific trap this pattern was always designed to create. Picture the relief of that recognition, not triumphant or dramatic, but simply quietly grounding, the accumulated result of everything you've learned about a pattern that once felt so genuinely confusing and so difficult to name clearly. Because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. Covert narcissism is dangerous not because it's more severe than its louder counterpart, but because it's specifically, insidiously designed to hide in plain sight, disguised behind exactly the qualities most likely to generate compassion, patience, and continued investment from the people who care most genuinely about doing right by someone who seems to be struggling. Understanding this pattern clearly doesn't require you to stop being a compassionate, caring person. It simply requires you to direct that genuine compassion more wisely, protecting it from being systematically exploited by a pattern specifically calibrated to turn your own best qualities into the very mechanism of your own quiet, gradual harm.